Well, a UN-backed report has issued a dire warning for Gaza. Half of Gazans are experiencing catastrophic hunger and famine is imminent unless there's urgent intervention. Now, the warning comes as Israel faces increasing pressure from its allies to allow more aid into the territory.
Huge crowds of Gazans gathered to receive aid at this shelter run by the United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees, amid an increasing hunger crisis in the Gaza Strip, where aid has only been trickling in since the beginning of the war.
People are dying. We are asking the Arab people to press for a ceasefire in Gaza. We are exhausted and dying.
The United Nations has published its latest report warning that Gaza is on the brink of famine. The UN humanitarian coordinator in Gaza says that he's working with Israel to open up more land routes for aid shipments.
As soon as the goods come in, the 200 trucks a day or whatever the case may be, it's not enough to satisfy the numbers that we have to address. And so as soon as goods come in, they don't get stored anywhere for very long. Unless we can put significant supply increases into those areas, those people who are at catastrophic levels of malnutrition or food insecurity will face real serious problems.
The EU's top diplomat, Josep Borrell, believes Israel is using famine as a weapon of war.
In Gaza, we are no longer on the brink of famine. We are in a state of famine, affecting thousands of people. We cannot stand by and watch Palestinians starve. What are we going to do? Because this famine is not a natural disaster. It's not a flood, it's not an earthquake. It's entirely man-made. By whom? Let's dare to say it. By whom?
While an aid shipment arrived in Gaza from Cyprus, and some countries have sponsored airdrops, aid agencies say that this is nowhere near enough and cannot replace the aid delivered via land crossings, where dozens of humanitarian aid trucks await permission to reach people in Gaza.
Well, US President Joe Biden has asked Israel to send a delegation to Washington to discuss Israel's plans for a ground offensive on Rafah in southern Gaza. Biden has warned Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that an assault on Rafah would be a mistake. Roughly 1.5 million people are sheltering there. Here's US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan.
Our position is that Hamas should not be allowed a safe haven in Rafah or anywhere else. But a major ground operation there would be a mistake. It would lead to more innocent civilian deaths, worsen the already dire humanitarian crisis, deepen the anarchy in Gaza, and further isolate Israel internationally. More importantly, the key goals Israel wants to achieve in Rafah can be done by other means. On the call today, President Biden asked the Prime Minister to send a senior interagency team composed of military, intelligence, and humanitarian officials to Washington in the coming days to hear U.S. concerns about Israel's current Rafah planning and to lay out an alternative approach that would target key Hamas elements in Rafah and secure the Egypt-Gaza border without a major ground invasion.
I'd like to welcome Gerald Feierstein. He's a former US ambassador and once served as Deputy Consul General in Jerusalem. He is Senior Vice President of the Middle East Institute. Ambassador, welcome to DW. Joe Biden has asked Benjamin Netanyahu to send officials to Washington over his plans for a ground offensive in Rafah. At the same time that Netanyahu really appears to be doubling down on these plans, how much pressure do you expect the US to put on Netanyahu here?
It's a pleasure to be with you this evening, and I think that clearly the administration is extremely concerned about the potential humanitarian catastrophe if the Israelis follow through on their threats to go in to Rafah. They've been signaling consistently for weeks now that they don't believe that the Israelis have put in place the means to protect the civilian population there. And to target Hamas operatives that are still in the Rafah area. And until they do that, until there's some clear understanding between Washington and Jerusalem about how to go forward, I think that we're going to see the administration continuing to emphasize the risks. And there is an increasing view, particularly among Democratic members of Congress, that the U.S. administration needs to be more explicit in telling Israel to stand back.
Let's talk about that. The US is pushing for what's being described as an alternative approach, and you're saying it will probably be more explicit. What do you think this alternative approach could mean?
Well, I think that as we heard from Jake Sullivan, the alternative approach would be not a major ground offensive into Rafah, but something more targeted, more precise in trying to identify where Hamas leadership may be hiding, and to use other kinds of military means to achieve those targets without threatening the security of the civilian population.
Ambassador, as someone with many years of diplomatic experience, particularly in the Middle East, I'd like to ask you, what do you make of where things stand right now in this conflict?
Well, I think that increasingly there is a great deal of frustration over the failure of diplomacy to achieve even a limited ceasefire. We have seen that there's going to be another Israeli delegation going to continue the negotiations. But the administration, I think, is very frustrated that they haven't been able to impress on either the Israelis or Hamas the need to take steps now that would address the humanitarian crisis and bring this fighting to a halt. And I think that, again, as the days and the weeks go by, the pressure on the Biden administration to do something more to bring this conflict to an end is only going to increase.
That was former US Ambassador Gerald Feierstein. Ambassador, thank you very much for your time and your insights today.
It's a pleasure.